They gave me a chair at the back of the room. I noticed it the moment I walked in. Every other delegate had a seat at the long obsidian table, the Keth scholars in their layered ceremonial armor, the Varesi fleet sages in robes that shifted color with their breathing, the Draal chronicler coiled elegantly around a custom perch designed specifically for its physiology. And then there was my chair, small, human-sized, pushed against the far wall, like someone had remembered me at the last minute and didn't want to rearrange the table. I sat down, opened my notebook, and said nothing. My name is Dr. Mara Voss. I spent 11 years as a combat medic before I spent 20 more as a military historian. I have walked through the aftermath of things I will not describe here. I have read every major strategic doctrine produced by every spacefaring civilization currently seated at the Concord table. I was invited to Keth Solara as a courtesy delegate, which is a polite way of saying that humanity needed a representative, and I was the one who showed up. They did not expect very much from me. I could tell by the way War Master Venn introduced me to the room, a brief, generous sentence about humanity's promising developmental trajectory, which is the academic equivalent of a pat on the head. Venn was Keth, 7 feet of gray-blue muscle, and 300 years of military tradition, walking around in one body. He had personally overseen the resolution of 4 interstellar conflicts. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the greatest strategic minds alive. He was also, I would discover, working from a flawed model. But that was for later. The first day belonged entirely to them, and I was glad for it. Fleet Sage Oren of the Varesi presented the foundations of what the Concord called the Keth Varesi Unified Field of Conflict, 3 centuries of accumulated doctrine, tested across more than 40 wars, refined by the greatest military thinkers of 6 species. It was, genuinely, extraordinary work. Elegant in the way that a very old bridge is elegant. You can see every generation of thought in it, each layer built carefully on the last, nothing wasted. I filled an entire notebook. I asked no questions. My hosts seemed to appreciate this. At the midday break, Uran made a comment to Venn that the human delegate was receptive, which in Varesi diplomatic language is high praise. I smiled and refilled my water glass, and did not mention that I was being receptive the way a surgeon is receptive before she picks up the scalpel. That evening in my quarters, I did something simple. I took the core assumptions of the Keth Varesi doctrine, every foundational premise I had identified during the day's presentations, and I mapped them against a list I had brought from home. The list had taken me 3 years to compile. It was every documented instance in human military history where the predicted outcome of a conflict was wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically, embarrassingly, model-shatteringly wrong. The list was 247 entries long. I did not sleep much that night. The second morning began with a presentation on attrition calculus, which is the Concord's framework for predicting when a civilization will seek peace. The model is genuinely sophisticated. It accounts for resource curves, population thresholds, economic breaking points, and something the Varesi called the surrender horizon, the precise moment when a rational civilization determines that continued fighting costs more than surrender. According to the Concord's records, this model had predicted the end of 31 conflicts with near-perfect accuracy. I raised my hand about 40 minutes in. Venn looked mildly surprised. Visitors did not typically interrupt the morning session. He nodded at me with the careful courtesy of someone who expects a simple question. I asked, "What variable in the attrition calculus accounts for a combatant that continues fighting after the model says they should have stopped?" There was a brief silence. Venn answered smoothly, "Edge cases," he said. "Irrational behavior at the command level. Statistically negligible in any conflict of meaningful scale. The model corrects for outliers naturally over time." I opened my notebook to a page I had marked the night before. I told him I had 214 examples from a single planet's military history. Then I began to read. Not all of them. I am not a cruel person, but I walked them through Stalingrad, where a surrounded army fought street by street through a Russian winter, until the mathematics of survival became completely meaningless, and something else entirely took over. I walked them through the defense of Malta, a small island that absorbed years of bombing from a vastly superior force, and simply refused to break. I walked them through Chosin Reservoir, the siege of Leningrad, the defense of Rorke's Drift, and about a dozen others that I selected specifically because each one represented a different reason why the surrender horizon had failed to appear on schedule. The morning session did not recover from this. By the afternoon, Veth, the Drawl chronicler, who had been the quietest presence in the room, had moved its perch closer to my section of the table and was asking me follow-up questions in a low, careful voice. Urun had gone very still. I would later learn that stillness in the Varesi is not inattention. It is the opposite. It means something has entered their mind that requires their full internal processing power. Ven was still composed, but his stylus had stopped moving. That told me more than anything else. On the third day, they gave me the floor. Ven framed it as an invitation. The Concord was generous in offering visiting scholars time to present, but I understood what it actually was. They needed to hear what I was building toward. The questions of the day before had left something open in the room, and an open question in a room full of military theorists is like a splinter. It demands attention. I want to be clear about something. I did not go to Keth Solara to embarrass anyone. The Concord's doctrine was 300 years of genuine intellectual work by some of the finest minds in the galaxy. It deserved respect. What it also deserved, because all serious work deserves this, was honest engagement. I presented what I called the irrationality coefficient. My argument was straightforward, though it took me 90 minutes to build it properly. Every species currently seated in the Concord had reached the stars through optimization. They had survived their home worlds, their early wars, their resource crises, their first contact events, by becoming extraordinarily good at making rational calculations under pressure. This was a profound strength. It was also, I argued, a civilizational blind spot, because their doctrine was written entirely by and for species that thought this way. The Keth Varesi framework was a model of war between optimizing minds. It was very good at predicting what an optimizing mind would do. What it could not account for, what it had no variable for, was a combatant who had somewhere in their history learned to use the opponent's model of them as a weapon. Humanity, I told them, did not optimize the way they had. We survived by being willing to do the thing that shouldn't work. Not out of stupidity. I was careful about this, because it is the most common misreading, but because we had learned, through a very long and very painful history, that the opponent's expectation of your behavior is a boundary, and boundaries, if you understand them clearly enough, can be crossed. I walked them through 3 case studies. The first was Midway, a naval battle in which a smaller, damaged fleet used intercepted intelligence and precise timing to destroy a larger force that had every material advantage. The second was the siege of Leningrad, 900 days of civilian endurance that no rational projection of human survival limits could have predicted. The third was the Tet Offensive, a military operation that was, by every measurable standard, a catastrophic tactical defeat for the side that launched it, and yet functioned as one of the most decisive strategic victories of that entire conflict, because it destroyed the opponent's belief in their own narrative. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Ven challenged me. He was respectful about it, and sharp. He had not reached his position by accepting uncomfortable arguments without resistance. He pushed on my methodology, on my sample selection, on the question of whether human history was genuinely representative of anything beyond human history. These were fair challenges. I answered each one. He pushed again. I answered again. We went back and forth for nearly 2 hours, and somewhere in the middle of that exchange, something changed. Not in the argument, but in the room. It stopped feeling like a challenge, and started feeling like a collaboration. By the time we broke for the evening, Ven was writing in his own notebook. The 4th day was the one I had not prepared for. The Concord scholars arrived differently that morning. The challenge was gone. In its place was something quieter and harder to navigate. Genuine curiosity. Not about my methodology or my case studies. About the losses. Veth asked me about the Somme. A single battle from a single war, on a single planet, and yet somehow the chronicler had found the figure. 60,000 casualties in a single day. It asked me, with genuine care in its voice, why they had continued. I explained the command structures, the political pressures, the brutal logic of attrition warfare as it was understood in 1916, the fact that the men making decisions were working from models that were already 30 years out of date. It listened with the full weight of its attention. Urun asked about Vietnam. A smaller nation defeating a larger one. I explained the difference between winning battles and winning wars, the role of will versus logistics, the way a conflict's meaning to each side determines its endpoint far more powerfully than any resource calculation. Then Venn asked me the question that I think about still. He said that humans had a word, Pyrrhic, for a victory so costly it functioned as a defeat. He had researched it the previous evening. He told me that in the Concord's combined linguistic records, spanning 11 species and thousands of years of recorded conflict, there was no equivalent term. No other civilization had felt the need to name this specific thing. He asked me why we had. I took a moment before I answered. I told him it was because we built monuments to our defeats. Not just to our victories, any species does that, but to the places where everything went wrong and people died anyway. We had entire institutions devoted to the study of our failures. We named our catastrophes carefully and kept them in public memory because we had learned, across a very long history of catastrophes, that a loss you understand is a loss you can survive. A loss you paper over with pride is a loss that will find you again. I told him about the war memorials I had visited, the ones with every name carved into stone. Not because the names changed anything, but because the act of remembering them meant something about what we believed a person's life was worth. I told him about working as a combat medic, about what it does to your understanding of strategy when you have spent years watching strategy's consequences arrive in a field hospital. The room was very quiet. Siveth said, in a voice I had not heard it used before, that this was perhaps the most important piece of military doctrine it had encountered in 40 years of study. I told it I thought it was just called grief, but I understood what it meant. On the final day I stood at the front of the room. Venn had moved my chair to the table himself, first thing that morning, without comment, and I presented what I had been building toward all week. Not a replacement for the Keth doctrine, a completion of it. I proposed a formal addendum, which I titled with deliberate simplicity, the human coefficient. It was a structured framework for accounting and strategic doctrine, for the variables the Concord's model had left unnamed. Irrational persistence, the weaponization of narrative, the strategic value of being underestimated, the use of the opponent's predictive model as a tool against them, the military significance of a civilization that had built its identity, at least in part, around surviving things it was not supposed to survive. I was careful to frame it as what it was, an expansion, not a critique. The Concord's doctrine was not wrong. It was incomplete in a specific and correctable way, and here was the correction, fully sourced and formally structured, ready to be stress-tested by people far more credentialed than me. Venn formally moved that the seminar be extended, and the revision process begin immediately. Urun seconded. Sisaveth, in a gesture I was told later was extraordinarily rare for Dral scholars, added its own formal endorsement before the motion had even finished being recorded. I sat down. I allowed myself one small, private moment of something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief. It was the feeling of a thing done properly. At the farewell dinner that evening, Venn asked me what I had thought of the Concord's military tradition. I told him it was extraordinary. I told him the greatest compliment I knew how to give a body of knowledge was to argue with it seriously. He smiled at that, a slow, deliberate smile, and said that perhaps humanity had more to teach the Concord than the Concord had anticipated. I said that went both ways. On my way out of the college the next morning, a young Varesi cadet stopped me in the corridor. She was nervous and stood very straight, the way young people stand when they are trying to look older. She asked if I would be willing to read her thesis. She was writing about asymmetric conflict, she said. She had stayed up the previous 3 nights reading every source I had cited during the week. I said yes. I always say yes to that question. I have been given the chair at the back of the room my entire career. In field hospitals, in academic departments, in diplomatic chambers on stations orbiting stars whose names I cannot pronounce. Every time, I sat down, opened my notebook, and got to work. The chair never mattered. The work did. It always does.